Okay, I feel the need to talk about this and to start a discussion about it because it's been driving me fucking crazy ever since yesterday, ever since I made my video where I talked about my problems with Hibike Euphonium Season 2 and why I was dropping it. And I was reading a lot of the discussion and stuff on that video, and I learned a bunch of things that just made me confused and angry. And I have all these Euphonium posters in my room, so every time I see one, I just get reminded of it. So, okay, in that video, I talked about how I was very confused about the relationship between Kumiko and Reina, and I said that in the first season, we were told in no uncertain terms that Kumiko was in love with Reina, and that Reina was in love with her teacher, and yet the two of them seemed to be, like, dating or something. And this was confusing. So I got a lot of response about this. First of all, a bunch of people pointing out that in the novels that the series is based on, then Kumiko, at the end of the third one, actually it gets into a relationship with the guy, I think his name's Shuichi, who, throughout the whole first season, we know that he is into her. Like, that's pretty blatant, but she seems to have no interest in him. Like, they used to be friends or something. I had kind of gotten the impression that the fact that he clearly likes her is why she was, like, avoiding him because she didn't like him back. But apparently they get together at the end of the third novel. Now, this doesn't happen in the show. I've also heard that at the end of Season 2, then there's implication that Kumiko is in love with Asuka, as opposed to Reina. So a different, potentially lesbian relationship that she's in, as opposed to with Shuichi. I've also been told that there's this interview with Yamada Naoko, who is, one of the, sort of the chief director, I guess, on this show. Not completely clear whether she's more in creative control or the director. I'm not entirely sure, but she's in a lot of interviews about Euphonium. And she says that she was never trying to depict a Yuri romance. She was trying to depict just an adolescent's friendship. Now, the reason I want to talk about this is because if the intention of this show was not to make it seem as though Kumiko and Reina were in a romantic relationship, I think it failed. I think the show failed to convey that. And I want to talk about that because I think it's important to acknowledge what a show seems to be trying to do, like what the feeling a show gives off. Because in the world of Yuri anime, almost everything is implication. There are very few Yuri anime that are actually just like hardline, this is about lesbian romance, And I was really big into Yuri in the late 2000s, and I would always see that there's sort of different tiers of Yuri. There's the outright stuff that's actually about lesbian romance, then there's the stuff where it's heavily implied, and then there's the stuff where it's just kind of implied, and all three of them would be very attractive to Yuri fans, but there's a whole different level of meaning that comes from different levels of implication, where, like, it's really nice and refreshing when a show actually fucking goes through with it. And a big part of what was appealing about Hibike Euphonium to me was that it felt like the show was actually fucking going through with it. That it wasn't just implications. Even though we never got a scene of the characters, actually, there's no big kiss scene or anything like that, and there didn't have to be for it to be sold as a Yuri show, but Kumiko outright says the phrase, "I love you," to Reina, And yeah, that phrase doesn't have to mean romantic love, but the show does so much to imply that there's a romantic attraction between them. They go on a date scene. It's like the most romantic fucking scene ever. In the middle of this show, they're going up this mountain, and Reina has this line about how, like Kumiko asks, "Don't your feet hurt in those shoes?" And Reina's like, "It does, but I don't hate pain." And Kumiko says, "Oh, that's kind of hot," So it's sort of, it seems like the point of that line is to imply some level of attraction to Reina, It could just be a joke. It doesn't have to mean that. But in the context of this scene, this very slow-burning, beautifully drawn, romantic-feeling scene about these girls going off to be in a secluded space, to have a deep, heartfelt conversation, and there's a tinge of this flirtatiousness to it. And then they go up on the mountain, and, Reina, runs her fingers down Kumiko's face all lovingly, and it's gorgeously animated. Reina's wearing this very sort of, I won't say sultry, but she's in a gown and she looks very beautiful, you know. Everything about this feels like a particularly romantic scene. Like, the point of this is to say, yes, we're going through with this romance scene here. And so to find out that that was not intended to be a romantic scene is, like, baffling to me. Like, because it seems like they were going out of their way to imply romance. And if they weren't, there were no shortage of ways they could have made that clear. They could have, you know, either not made it so blatantly romantic or thrown in a phrase somewhere where someone says, by the way, we're not romantically in love or something. Just anything to make that clear, because it's really not clear, in my opinion. You know, we go from that scene, this heightened romantic date scene, to a scene where Kumiko says that she's in love with Reina. You know, scenes of them, like, you know, there's lots of contact between them, which is rare in anime, in Japan. They're not a very touchy-feely kind of people. Just people who are just friends don't tend to hold hands a whole lot, you know? Now, again, not to say that any of that would be impossible. If they wanted to make a show about just a platonic but very deep friendship, you know, that's understandable, but it just doesn't come off that way. And there's no moment where you can tell it's not that. Like, the only thing you have to go on, really, is that Reina is not in love with Kumiko. That Reina is in love with Taki-sensei. But there is no hint of the idea that Kumiko is not in love with Reina. Especially when she says, I love you, you know. Just the way that scene's presented feels like a confession. Everything about the show feels like it's trying to say, Kumiko's in love with Reina. And again, like, the reason I'm bringing this up is because, like, again, it's not unfair to say that all these things could happen in a platonic friendship. It's not like saying I love you automatically means, you know, that she's romantically in love with her. It's not like the date scene automatically means that. But if that's not what they were going for, why would they present it that way? Why would they make it so fucking blatant? You know, in a world where I have to sit through 1,000 implying Yuri shows, 1,000 shows where, you know, there's a bunch of cute girls in a club and some of them occasionally kind of longingly look at one another and you think, oh, it's like, you know, oh, I wonder if they're, you know, actually gay, but it never goes all the way, because if it did, then it would shatter the illusion that you could be with those characters. You know, that's why these shows are, I think, a big part of why these shows are always implying. Because if they outright say these girls are gay, then you can't have them. And the audience is otaku. You know, it's a male otaku audience. And that's not the case for Hibike Euphonium. It's clearly not aimed at otaku. It's, you know, it's an original novel written by a woman, largely female staff, you know, making a show that is a sort of a adolescent girl romance drama, it seems like. Nothing about it screams, this is for otaku, you know? It feels like a show that's trying to say something realer than that. That's trying to let its characters be their own people and not care about how the audience is going to, you know, relate to and interpret them. Like, it's not about trying to appeal to the guys watching the show by saying, like, oh, maybe they're Yuri, but they're still available. It doesn't feel like that. It feels like it's trying to be a show about a lesbian romance, you know, in total sincerity. And so it's very disappointing to me to realize that it's not the case. You know, like, that was a big part of what made those scenes so interesting and appealing, was the idea that, like, yeah, this is an actual show about actual lesbian romance. One that has a deeply romantic scene that we're not getting out of any of the other ones, you know? Yeah, you can go watch Strawberry Panic and have a show about lesbian couples, but it's a trashy, you know, fucking soap drama. Like, it's corny, and it doesn't have these deeply romantic, really meaningful scenes in it, you know? How often do we get that? How often are we going to get that, you know? Even like Yuri on Ice, which was a great, you know, yaoi series that seemingly was all up front about the idea these characters are gay. Even that, like, you know, never was willing to make that jump into having them just kiss. You know, like, there's a scene where it looks like they do, but the arm goes in front of his face so you don't see it. And I'm just like, but at least it felt Like if they suddenly made another season of Yuri on Ice and they revealed that Victor and Yuri were just good friends, you know, and that it was all just implication, but then they both end up with women or something, I would be fucking furious. I think a lot of people would be furious. And I feel the same way about Euphonium. The concept that these two, and like when you watch the early episodes of season 2, the way that Kumiko looks at and talks about Reina is not the way you talk about a friend. You know, she like sits there and thinks about how attractive the things that Reina is doing are. She's sitting there thinking about like, wow, she looks so pretty backlit by moonlight, and you know, and man, she's so adorable when she's mad, and like all of her thoughts are things you think about a lover, you know, and yet all the way through, they're doing all these, they're holding hands, they're getting close. Reina seems to be, you know, like leading a romantic relationship with her, in spite of the fact that it's constantly insisted that she's in love with Taki Sensei, that she's not in love with Kumiko, and Kumiko is backing her up. So you really get this sense like that the text of the show is saying these two are just friends, but the subtext is blaring sirens on full blast. This is Yuri. These two are in a relationship, you know? They talk like they're in a relationship. They act like they're in a relationship. Every scene they have is gorgeously romantic, you know? I just can't... Like, the idea of presenting just a deep friendship with this sort of almost, fetishistic attention to detail, like the way that, you know, like Kumiko's looking at Reina and you're seeing like the lights behind her and she's like tossing her hair back and looking all beautiful and stuff, and it's like, who thinks that way about their best friend? You know, I don't know. I mean, maybe it's just that's just the kind of relationship they're going for. Something a little bit more complicated where there's like an undercurrent of romance, but they're just good friends. Maybe that's the intentions of the relationship. I don't know, and I don't, like, that's not as interesting to me as if they were just actually a couple, you know, and we were actually getting a legitimate lesbian romance show. And instead, we've got these weird implications all over the place, you know, and I really think that if this was the intention, then I think the show is less good because of that. I think that the fact that it so heavily feels like it's implying something else other than what's actually shown is bad directing. It's like they've convinced you of something that you're not supposed to be convinced of. And I know there's some people who didn't ever feel like the two were in a relationship. Some people just felt like it was a strong friendship. So maybe for those people, this all makes sense. And maybe for them, there's no problem, and the show has always been exactly what you thought it was, you know. And good for you if that's the case. But for me, there's definitely a sense of loss of realizing that, like, that it was all just an illusion, that it was all implication, and none of, like, that relationship was actually something else. And, you know, it would recolor my interpretation of the whole show. Like, rewatching it, you know, how I would feel about that date scene would be very different if I don't think that Kumiko is actually attracted to, you know, and hoping for a relationship with Reina in that whole instance. So, yeah, I don't know. It's weird to me. Maybe I'll warm up to it. Maybe if I watch it again, knowing what it's supposed to be, then I'll feel differently. Maybe it'll be like, okay, I can still appreciate this as a beautiful friendship scene. It's just, yeah, it drives me crazy to think that, you know, here I am a year and a half later after the original show, and all this new information that's been brought to my attention has completely changed what I thought the show was about. You know, and some of that might be my fault, but they could have been more clear about what they were going for in the direction. So yeah, that's that.